A dark silhouette cuts across the Caribbean horizon. It is a massive oil tanker, moving thousands of barrels of sanctioned crude oil. Then, a flash of high-intensity light. The roar of helicopters descends from the sky. U.S. Special Operations Forces, supported by the Coast Guard, fast rope onto the deck. In a bold, high-stakes move, the vessel allegedly part of a network moving illicit oils seized and its cargo confiscated. This is not a scene from an action movie. This is the reality of the ongoing high-seas economic war between the United States and Venezuela. It is a dramatic escalation that sends shockwaves far beyond Caracas and Washington, striking directly at the fragile economies and security of the entire Caribbean basin. This seizure, an explicit act of enforcement against oil for sanctions evasion, is the most vivid expression yet of a century of tension. It is a conflict rooted in oil ideology and geopolitical dominance, a struggle that has now made the waters of the Caribbean one of the world's most critical flashpoints. The story of U.S.-Venezuelan tension is almost as old as Venezuela's oil industry itself. When the great oil boom began in the early 20th century, Venezuela quickly became one of the largest oil exporters globally. American companies such as Gulf Oil and Standard Oil were at the heart of this development, establishing a relationship of influence that many Venezuelans would later view as exploitation. Washington's initial stance was defined by the Monroe Doctrine and its 1904 expansion, the Roosevelt Corollary. This doctrine asserted the right of the United States to intervene in Latin American affairs to prevent European powers from collecting debts by force. This policy, born in part from the 1902-1903 Venezuelan crisis, where European nations blockaded ports over debt payments, established an American prerogative for economic and political oversight in the region. For decades, Venezuela was a key U.S. oil supplier, a relationship primarily managed through its conservative elite. The vast oil wealth, however, created massive social inequality. The price swings of the 1980s and 1990s decimated the Venezuelan economy, creating the perfect environment for a radical political shift. Enter Hugo Chávez Freitas, a former army paratrooper. Chávez led a failed coup in 1992 before successfully winning the presidency in 1998. He promised a socialist Bolivarian revolution, a total break from the neoliberal consensus of the past. Chávez's rise marked the true geopolitical rupture with the U.S. He immediately sought to consolidate power and redistribute oil wealth. In 2001, he enacted a controversial set of laws, including one that gave the state oil company, PDVSA, majority control over all oil ventures. This directly challenged the interests of U.S. and other international oil majors. The tension boiled over in April 2002. A wave of opposition protests and an oil workers' strike culminated in a brief coup d'état. Chávez was removed, only to be reinstated 47 hours later by loyal military units and popular support. The U.S. was accused of having prior knowledge of the plot and tacitly supporting the coup leaders. Though it denied direct involvement. This event cemented a deep and lasting mutual distrust. Chávez now openly branded the U.S. an imperial power, seeking to overthrow him. Under Chávez, and later his chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro, oil became a political weapon and a tool for regional influence. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels. In Lao Tse, before Chávez consolidated control and the subsequent economic decline, Venezuela produced around 3.0 million barrels per day, BPD. Chávez leveraged this resource to forge new, non-U.S. alliances. The most significant was the Petro-Caribe Agreement launched in 2005. This generous deal allowed 18 Caribbean and Central American nations to purchase Venezuelan oil at preferential prices, paying only a fraction up front, with the remainder financed over 25 years at a low interest rate of about 1%. For small, energy import-dependent CARICOM states like Jamaica, Dominica, and Haiti, Petro-Caribe was an economic lifeline. It instantly shifted regional loyalty toward Caracas and away from Washington. Venezuela also deepened its bond with Cuba, exchanging highly subsidized oil for the services of thousands of Cuban doctors and security personnel, creating a powerful anti-U.S. axis. The oil-funded Golden Age was unsustainable. Mismanagement, corruption, and a global oil price crash in 2014 plunged Venezuela into crisis. The U.S. responded to the growing authoritarianism of the Maduro government, particularly after his disputed 2018 re-election, with escalating sanctions. Initial sanctions, focused on asset freezes and specific individuals, hardened into devastating measures. In January 2019, the U.S. imposed a blanket ban on the purchase of Venezuelan oil, cutting off the country's main revenue source. U.S. sanctions have been directly linked to the collapse of oil production. By 2020, production had fallen to historical lows, averaging under 500,000 bpd, a mere fraction of the Chávez-era peak. This drastic decline strangled the economy, leading to a humanitarian catastrophe. The economic shock rippled through the Caribbean, with Venezuela unable to maintain its subsidized shipments. The Petro-Caribe arrangement effectively collapsed. Caribbean nations were forced back into the open, volatile oil market. According to multiple Caribbean leaders, the U.S. sanctions forced them to purchase costlier fuel elsewhere, severely straining their limited national budgets and driving up the cost of electricity and goods. The very policy meant to pressure Caracas had created an economic crisis for Washington's Caribbean allies, causing many CARICOM states to publicly call for the sanctions to be lifted. The energy security initiative that Washington offered as an alternative never matched the scale or generosity of Petro-Caribe. The humanitarian crisis sparked the largest displacement in Latin American history. By late 2023, nearly 7.9 million Venezuelan refugees and migrants had fled their country. The majority, more than 6.7 million, within Latin America and the Caribbean. While the U.S. and Colombia host the largest absolute numbers, the impact on smaller Caribbean island nations is disproportionate. Trinidad and Tobago, a short distance from Venezuela's coast, has absorbed tens of thousands of migrants, placing immense strain on its public services. Neighboring Guyana has also seen a significant influx, adding a layer of complexity to the already intense, resource-driven border dispute. This border tension, centered on the Essequibo region of vast, resource-rich territory administered by Guyana, but claimed by Venezuela, has recently escalated into a military standoff. The renewed conflict is driven almost entirely by oil. Since 2015, massive offshore oil and gas discoveries in the Essequibo by U.S. energy giant ExxonMobil have transformed Guyana into a potential energy superpower. Maduro's government has since revived the 19th century claim, holding a late 2023 referendum on annexing the territory and subsequently announcing plans to appoint officials to the region. This act was denounced by CARICOM and the U.S. as a threat to regional stability and Guyana's sovereignty. The U.S. has since conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, a clear signal of support, further tightening the geopolitical knot. As U.S. pressure intensified, Venezuela turned to a new set of powerful allies, effectively transforming the crisis into a new Cold War proxy dynamic in the Western Hemisphere. Russia, a major military partner since the Chávez era, has provided advanced weaponry, including warplanes and air defense systems like the S-300VM, totaling approximately $14.5 billion in exports since 2001. Moscow views Venezuela as a strategic foothold near the U.S. and a critical partner in energy coordination through the OPEC+ alliance. China is Venezuela's largest creditor, having extended billions of dollars in loans often repaid through oil shipments, thereby cushioning Caracas from Western sanctions. Iran has become a vital supplier of the diluents necessary to process Venezuela's heavy crude, enabling it to maintain some export capacity despite U.S. prohibitions. The recent seizure of the oil tanker, allegedly carrying a mix of Venezuelan and Iranian sanctioned oil, underscores this growing axis of sanction-defying trade. The Caribbean Sea itself has become an operational theater for this geopolitical struggle. The collapse of the Venezuelan economy has coincided with the expansion of narco-trafficking routes. The vast, ungoverned coastlines of Venezuela, combined with the presence of criminal organizations, have facilitated the movement of narcotics destined for the U.S. and European markets. This illicit trade now utilizes maritime routes that weave through the islands of the Eastern Caribbean. The U.S. has responded with increased maritime patrols and the deployment of U.S. Coast Guard and Navy assets. These operations, framed as counter-narcotics efforts, effectively increase the U.S. military presence directly off Venezuela's coast, creating a constant, low-grade security tension. As the 2020s progress, the U.S.-Venezuela crisis continues its relentless churn. Periodic shifts in U.S. policy, from sanctions waivers for specific oil for debt agreements to the recent revocation of General Oil licensing, create a climate of profound uncertainty. The recent dramatic seizure of the Venezuelan tanker is a powerful message. The U.S. will use all available means to enforce its sanctions regime. This action, alongside the escalating military posture over the Essequibo dispute, could push the Maduro government further into the orbit of its non-Western allies. For the Caribbean, the future is tied to this instability. The regional security outlook is now dominated by the threat of interstate conflict between Venezuela and Guyana. Energy policy is dependent on the fluctuating status of U.S. sanctions and the potential, though distant, return of a full-scale Petro-Carib-style deal. Migration flows will continue to stress local resources, and the presence of foreign naval assets, whether American, Russian, or Chinese, will keep the Caribbean Sea a zone of complex, contested authority. The tension between the United States and Venezuela is no longer a distant diplomatic spat. It is a seismic force that is reshaping the political, economic, and security architecture of every nation it touches. The question for the next decade is not if the Caribbean will be affected, but how long it can withstand the pressure before the regional stability it relies upon finally breaks.